Hello, welcome to this video where we're going to look at how to print the forms for Mastery Manager item bank assessments. So the first thing you're going to do is find your assessment. For this particular video, I'm going to use the Math 1 Initial Growth Assessment. You can use the assessment finder here under the Assessments button to look for assessments. So for this particular one, I look for grade 6 math. The list gets filtered every time you make an adjustment up here, and then I'm going to click on that assessment. Shows you the setup, which will tell you how many points everything is worth, what kinds of items are there, and then what the weighting of those different items are. And then also at the bottom, it will tell you what standards are covered on the assessment. You're going to click on the forms in the link line in order to print. And the first thing you want to do is select which students that you would like the assessment to be assigned to. You can select particular students if you need to do a makeup or for some other reason you need to select individual students. Like maybe you have a student who has a vision impairment and you need to select that student and then change the font size of their particular assessment. You can do that here. Typically though, you're going to be printing for all of your students. The next part, and I'm going to ignore the semester box here because that typically is not used. The next part here is printing forms, the options for printing the forms. You'll notice that you can select sections. For this particular assessment, there is only one section, so you can only do the one section. But if you were to make an item bank assessment with multiple sections, you can actually just print one section. Let's say you want to get a read on a particular student's for a particular standard, and the sections are built in such a way that each section is a different standard. You could actually print out the section on the particular standard you're looking at and only have that student take that part and scan that in. You can have it shade every other question. That is default checked, and I usually just leave it that way. It makes it easier for students to differentiate questions. You can print on both sides of the form. I typically don't because that can introduce errors as students are writing on both sides of the form. Sometimes that the ink or the pencil from one side can cause errors in scanning on the other, so I typically don't do that. You can prevent your name from being printed on the form, and you can group the questions together. One of the things I like about the Mastery Manager system here is whenever you find a little question mark, you can mouse over it and it will tell you something about that particular item. So you can see how normally each question has its own little bubble around it. If you group the questions, it kind of condenses that whole thing and makes it into one block. Again, you can change the default font size. We are trying to build the assessments in such a way that changing this value will actually change the assessment, the font in the assessments, but you have to build them in the right way in order for that to take place. If you specify the font size when you're building the assessment, then changing the default font size won't change anything. So you want to make sure that we build those assessments that way. If you find that you're trying to make the font size bigger and it's not working, let me know, let Dave Beatty know. Send me an email at dbeatty@elmhurst205.org so I can go in and take a look at that assessment and see if I can help fix the font size. You can print blank forms if you'd like, and this is the place where you'd indicate that. You might do that if, say, you've got a newer student who's not in Mastery Manager yet, but you want them to take an assessment for the rest of the class. You can print a blank form, have them fill out their name and their ID number at the top of the form, bubble in their ID number, and then wait to scan the form until they're actually in the Mastery Manager system, but you could still have them take it at the same time. The next block is the place where you can pick options for the different student use forms. So these are forms that are going to be put in front of students. So you can print bubbles differently. So vertically print bubbles instead of, this way where they're horizontal, you can have them print vertically. Depending on the items you have, you might want to do that. I don't think any of the item bank assessments that we've created call for that, but that's an option you can use. You can make the bubbles larger for a case where a student has an IEP or some other need to have larger bubbles. These two things are typically the ones we're going to want to be looking at, the printing questions on the forms and grading performance event questions on student forms. So again, this block is the forms that are meant to go in front of students. So if you would like to print the questions on those forms, then you select this box and you now are going to print questions on the forms. You can change the way that works. You can put those in multiple columns. You can randomize the questions. Or you can print the questions with the student forms, which means it'll print a question form and then a student form for answers, and then a question form and then a student form for answers. So that's something you could do also. Another thing you can put on the student forms is the grading bubbles for performance event questions. So these are questions that a teacher actually has to go in and look at and score before scanning in. So if you select this box, it's going to print them right on the student forms. That can be confusing for students. If you feel like your students, you can communicate that to them and say there's going to be bubbles on your forms on questions, 4 and 5, and you just need to leave those bubbles blank. I want you to write in the answer, and then I'm going to go back and score them on the student forms. This is a way to save paper. It's a way to easily score the tests right on the same form, so you're only scanning just one set of forms, but it can be a little confusing for students, so I'll leave it up to you as to whether you want to print them on the form. One thing is if a student does go in and bubble in a question on accident, when you're going back to grade it and you notice that, if that is the wrong point value, in other words, you were going to fill in a different point value, you can actually just put an X through that bubble that the student made and bubble in something else. And the Mastery Manager program, when it scans, it will actually see that and not count the X'd out bubble and count the one that you bubbled in. So there are some easy ways where you don't have to spend a bunch of time erasing or anything like that to do that, but this is a way to save some paper. The other thing you can do is you can print forms for teacher use. So let's say you've already printed the student use forms and you want to print a form for you to grade the performance event items on. That is what you would use this box for. I would not use the one page for each student use form. That's going to create a lot of papers. Use the student roster layout is typically the best way to go. That will be print a line for each student. I'll actually show you what that looks like. Consolidate bubbles if possible, and then including a zero bubble. If you didn't want that to be an option, you can click that as well, but I don't think that is the case for any of our tests. So teacher forms are going to look like this, where each section will have, this is probably a better one to look at, each section will have a roster list that's alphabetical of all your students in that section, and then there will be a place to bubble in. Each one of these columns is a different question. The number corresponds to the student test. If the student's absent, you can click you can mark the A. Otherwise, you just bubble in the number of points for each question that the student goes as you're grading, as you're scoring the test. You just bubble in the points. This is what the teacher use forms look like. So typically, you can save a lot of paper by putting the things here like this if you have items to bubble in like that. If you were going to print everything on one page, all the stuff, you're going to print the questions, the student answers, which come without clicking anything on here, and the performance event teacher bubbles. You'd click on print questions, grade performance items on the student forms, and then your test would look like this. Where each question has the question, all the answer choices, the bubbles for the students to fill in, the open response items, it has space for the students to write, and then the place for the teacher to fill in the bubbles, open response item, place for the students to write, bubbles for a teacher to print. Now, when you actually get to the printing stage, so let's say we're ready to print this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up that file in Adobe Acrobat because you want to be really careful about the printing setup. So when you open that file in Adobe Acrobat, typically they go in your downloads folder. So if you open Your File Explorer, computer, wherever, documents, wherever you save this stuff. In your Downloads folder, you'll typically find that's where it is. When you go to print it, you're going to make sure you uncheck Auto Rotate and Center. You're going to make sure you've page scaling none. You want to make sure all of those options are unchecked because when these things go to scan, I'm just going to print like a non-preview version of one test. And see, when it comes up down here, if you click on it here, typically that'll bring it up in your Chrome browser. You don't want to print these from your Chrome browser because you don't have all the settings you need to make sure you uncheck all of them. Worst thing to have happen is to have a student take an assessment and then you can't scan it. Oh, I gotta turn that off first. Okay, here it is. So here's what one actually looks like. It's got all the pieces here. Notice in the printing settings when you go to print these, it says page scaling set to none, page sizing actual size, or scale. Scale set to 100%. Uncheck options such as auto rotate and center, scale to fit. You want to uncheck, undo all of that sort of like fitting to page stuff. You want it to print exactly as it came out. So when we go to print the Adobe file, we want to make sure to uncheck auto rotate and center, make sure page scaling is set to none, and then we can print at that point. Okay, that's very important because if you print it wrong and then the kids take it and then you can't scan it, that's just a real feel bad moment for everybody. So you got to make sure to print it the right way. Okay, so this is a video on different printing options and how to print the item bank assessments from Mastery Manager.